To discover the origins of the men of Middle-earth, we must go back to a time long ago, before the fair and wondrous lands of Beleriand sank beneath the western sea. We must walk the wild paths of the First Age, when the world was still raw and untamed. For it was in this age of werewolves, vampires, and dragons that the first men of Middle-earth awoke. But where exactly did it all begin? And what do we know of the events that occurred in the lands of their awakening? As you will soon discover, we know much of the events of these long-faded days. And in this video, we will bring the story of the origins of men to life, with previously unseen artwork and a brand new map of the first age of Middle-earth, which has been developed especially for this video. So join me as we unravel the tale of the first men of Middle-earth. In the ancient days of Middle-earth, the stars dominated the skies. Countless, cold and fierce in their beauty, they hung like molten drops of mithril upon night's velvet canvas. They were the creations of Vada, each one set aflame by her hand. And it was beneath this canopy of starlight that the firstborn of Iluvatar stirred from their slumber. At the shores of Cuivienen, by the water's edge, as the elves drew their first breaths, they gazed up in wonder at the skies that stretched out above them. And for over 4,000 years, the elves would wander the lands under the faint glow of Vada's ethereal light. But the days of the stars were not to last. Far across the western sea, in the undying lands of Valinor, a great tragedy unfolded. The two trees, Laurelin and Telperion, whose mingled light had bathed the blessed realm in gold and silver radiance, were drained of their light by Melkor and Ungoliant. The Valar, the mighty powers who shaped and guarded the world, beheld the loss with sorrow. But they were not without hope. In the wake of grief, they resolved to kindle new lights for all of Arda to see. It was then that Tilion was called forth, chosen to bear a new light into the world. From Valinor's shores he ascended, bearing a pale vessel containing Telperion's last glowing flower. And as he rose, the moon's glow spilled across the world's face like fresh fallen snow upon dark stone. Soft and strange it was, a light of dreams and serenity. Next, Arien was chosen to bear Laurelin's last glowing fruit. Unlike Tilion's pale glow, Arien's fire was fierce and warm. She took up the great vessel and rose into the sky. Thus, the first dawn broke, burning with the glow of 1,000 dwarven forges. Golden light poured over hill and hollow, spilling into valleys long cloaked in shadow, and all evil things recoiled from it. The maiden whom the Valar chose from among the Maiar to guide the vessel of the sun was named Arien, and he that steered the island of the moon was Tilion. In the days of the trees, Arien had tended the golden flowers in the gardens of Vana and watered them with the bright dews of Laurelin. But Tilion was a hunter of the company of Orome, and he had a silver bow. He was a lover of silver, and when he would rest, he forsook the woods of Orome, and going into Lorien, he lay in dream by the pools of Este, in Telperion's flickering beams, and he begged to be given the task of tending forever the last flower of silver. Arien the maiden was mightier than he, and she was chosen because she had not feared the heats of Laurelin and was unhurt by them, being from the beginning a spirit of fire, whom Melkor had not deceived nor drawn to his service. Too bright were the eyes of Arien for even the Eldar to look on, and leaving Valinor, she forsook the form and raiment which, like the Valar, she had worn there, and she was as a naked flame, terrible in the fullness of her splendor. And it was at that moment, as Arien rose into the heavens and the first dawn lit the horizon, that men awoke. Their eyes blinked in wonder as the first golden rays warmed their skin. The elves may have awoken to starlight, soft and gentle, but men were born under the fires of the sun. Their lives would be short and their fates uncertain, but these men, the second-born, were destined for greatness. Thus began the Age of Men. In the far reaches of the world, cradled between the mountains of the wind and the East Sea, lay the land of Hildorian. There, at the edge of the world, where salt air mingled with the sharp bite of the mountain winds, the first men dwelled in the days of their dawn. And in the middle land, there were the mountains of the wind, for a wind blew strongly there, coming from the east before the sun. And Hildorian, the land where men first awoke, lay between these mountains and the eastern sea. When the elves awoke beside the starlit waters of Cuivienen, they were offered guidance and protection by the Valar, the powers of the world. Yet, from their first breath, men would have a natural fear of the Valar, for these powerful beings who had shaped the world were to them unfathomable and strange. It was perhaps for this very reason that no Valar would travel to Hildorian to guide men. Yet not all of the Valar forsook them. Ulmo, Lord of Waters, sent his messages to men by river and rain, by the crashing of waves and the soft trickle of streams. But men had not the natural gifts needed to fathom the meaning of such messages. Still, something in them stirred. Their hearts quickened at the sound of rushing currents, as if catching echoes of a song they could not name. And they loved the waters, but knew not why. And though they did not understand the great light of the sun, for they had not witnessed its kindling at the hands of the Valar, they loved it still. And with the coming of the sun, seeds planted beneath the surface of the earth long ago by Yavanna had begun to awaken, and the world blossomed. The meadows came to life with the song of the birds and the hum of insects. Flowers unfurled, revealing their beauty, while trees, ancient in thought but young in form, stretched out their leaves to drink in the sunlight. And the joy of men was as the joy of the morning, when the dew still clings to every blade of grass. It was a joy unshadowed by memory, for they had none. And it was a joy free of grief, for no sorrow had yet touched them. And in these days of tranquility, a voice came to men, and though it spoke without tongue or word, every soul understood its meaning. The voice said, "Ye are my children. I have sent you to dwell here. In time ye will inherit all this earth, but first ye must be children and learn. Call on me, and I shall hear, for I am watching over you." The voice was that of their creator, who was called Eru Ilúvatar. And though men knew not the shape of words nor the craft of speech, the voice of Ilúvatar had awoken the desire within men to shape sound into meaning and to name all that they could see. And so, from their lips came the first rough echoes of words. And henceforth, often did they lift their voices to Ilúvatar, seeking his counsel. And he would answer, his presence a steady source of guidance and comfort. But as the days passed, his voice grew distant, though not absent. When they called, he would reply not with answers, but with a gentle urging, for he wished for his children to learn for themselves. And he told them that in the seeking of answers, they would find joy, and in the striving for knowledge, they would grow wise. And men were restless and eager to learn, for their hearts brimmed with the stirrings of possibility, and the shapes and forms of things both familiar and strange took root in the fertile soil of their imagination. In the far distant past, they appear already to have had small tools of flint for scraping and cutting, and these they still used. They already had a knowledge of pigments, derived chiefly from plants, and they drew pictures and patterns on wood or flat surfaces of stone. Their first works were humble, but even in these early efforts, there dwelled the quiet spark of brilliance. Each tool fashioned, each vessel made, each line carved, hinted at a future where beauty and wonder would be wrought from jagged stone and humble wood. And so, their hands learned the rhythm of creation, and their minds, once still and unknowing, surged with restless ambition. And it was then, as the first men were beginning to learn and find their own way in the world, that a mysterious figure appeared before them, a vision of splendor whose hands bore many gifts, beautiful, radiant, and full of promise. Temptation had come to them, and it wore the face of generosity. One now came to men from beyond the lands of Hildorian. In a form similar to men he walked, yet he carried a radiance far beyond their own. He stood before them, serene and glorious, and his voice, when it came, wove through the air as he told them that he had come not out of duty nor command, but because news of their plight had reached him. "Ye should not have been left alone and uninstructed," he said. "The world is full of marvelous riches which knowledge can unlock. Ye could have food more abundant and more delicious than the poor things that ye now eat. Ye could have dwellings of ease, in which ye could keep light and shut out the night. Ye could be clad even as I." Then we looked, and lo, he was clad in raiment that shone like silver and gold, and he had a crown on his head and gems in his hair. The stranger extended his hand to men with the promise to shape them in his likeness, and men stepped forward, eager to follow his example and learn from him. Thus, he fed the restless craving to create and build that lay within their hearts, and men soon complained that his teachings came to them far more slowly than they had hoped. Yet, when doubt flickered or frustration gnawed at the edges of their faith in his teachings, he would appear before them once more bearing treasures they had only dreamed of, and he named himself the Giver of Gifts. He swore that the gifts would come to them unending if only they held fast to their faith in him. Before long, rather than forging their own fortunes, they instead came to depend upon him and his gifts, for he had woven wonders into their lives that they dared not lose. And the days before his coming now seemed barren, a dim and weary struggle, and when his teachings did come, his words fell upon them like rain on parched soil. For they hungered to understand the creatures that walked and flew, and the leaves and the roots of the trees that clung to the earth. They yearned to understand the origins of their own kind and how they came to be, and they desired knowledge of the celestial lights and of the vast, silent void in which the lights were set. Everything he taught seemed to be steeped in wisdom, and those who listened found themselves enriched by his knowledge. But as time went on, he began to speak of the dark more often. He whispered that he knew its secrets, for he himself had come from out of the dark. It was he claimed, who shaped the first light, who kindled the sun and the moon and scattered the stars across the heavens. He played upon their natural fear of the outer dark, promising protection from the very darkness he exalted. And he warned them that without him, the void would come for them, and it would devour them. In their curiosity, some men asked him about the voice which they had first heard speaking to them. But at the very mention of the voice, his gaze darkened, and his fury surged as his wrath carved itself onto his face. He called them fools and told them that the voice was the voice of the dark. He told them that it sought to steal them away from him. Then, without ceremony, he vanished. His absence and the absence of his gifts weighed upon men, their days stripped of abundance, their nights heavy with want. And then there came a time when the light of the sun faltered, and the skies over Hildorian grew heavy with gloom, and the world cowered beneath a shroud of deepening shadow. Fear crept through every living thing, seeping into flesh and bone. Then he appeared once more, striding through the blackness like a beacon of flame, and his presence cleaved the shadow. And when men beheld his coming, their knees buckled, and they bowed their heads so low that they pressed their faces to the ground in reverence of the giver of gifts. And so he spoke to them once more, and his voice carried with it both mercy and reproach. The darkness has not faded, he said, for it was still fed by those who heed the whisper from the abyss, the voice that leads hearts astray. And so he offered men a choice, to either follow the voice of the dark and let the void claim them, or to kneel before him, the only light in a darkening world. Thus they spoke the words he sought, pledging themselves to him and him alone, vowing never again to heed the words of the voice. Content with their pledge, he bid them raise a house upon high, a dwelling worthy of his presence, a place where they could ascend to seek his guidance and judgment. And when the house was wrought, he came. Before the seat of power he stood, in the midst of the fires that lit the house, and he called forth those who still took heed of the voice. Some men did still love the voice, yet they stood mute, bound by fear. Observing this silence, he bade them bow before him, and let no doubt linger in their hearts. And though they feared, all now knelt as shadows bow before the rising sun. And all bowed to the ground before him, saying, "Thou art the one great, and we are thine." Thereupon he went up as in a great flame and smoke, and we were scorched by the heat. But suddenly he was gone, and it was darker than night, and we fled from the house. From that time forth he rarely walked among them. The gifts he once offered so freely faded into memory. Yet, in their moments of dire need, when desperation outweighed their fear of him, they would creep to his house and plead for help. And he would answer. Yet no aid would he grant without a price. A task was ever set before them, or a precious thing demanded in return for his aid. And with each passing season, his demands grew heavier, his tasks crueler. Then, in the bleakest of nights, with despair clinging to them, the first voice came to them one last time, telling them that, though they had cast him aside and forgotten him in favor of another, they were still his. He told them that it was he who had given them life, and that now the days of their lives would be shortened, and they would wither like the leaves of autumn, and soon each of them would stand before him and see the truth laid bare. But instead of clarity, his words brought dread. For many now believed that the voice was the voice of the dark that loomed beyond the stars. And as men began to die, those who still lived feared to go into the dark. And so they went to the house, and there they knelt, calling out for deliverance, begging him to shield them from the creeping hand of death. But long he remained silent, until they all came as one, and as they knelt, at last he appeared, radiant and towering. His majesty filled the space like light spilling from a suddenly shattered vessel. "Now ye are mine, and must do my will," he said. "I do not trouble that some of you die and go to appease the hunger of the dark. For otherwise there would soon be too many of you, crawling like lice on the earth. But if ye do not do my will, ye will feel my anger, and ye will die sooner, for I will slay you." From that time forward, they endured ever greater suffering. They were ravaged by exhaustion, gnawed by hunger, and brought low by sickness. Every aspect of the world around them seemed to rise in rebellion against them. Flames, once warm and guiding, raged wild and unbound. Rivers, once life-giving, turned treacherous and cruel. The creatures of the land, feathered, furred, and scaled, fled from their presence, save for those fierce enough to strike against them. Even plants and trees turned against them, and where men sought sustenance, they found poison instead. And beneath the trees, the shadows now stretched long and deep, harboring whispers of unseen threats. And men yearned to return to the simpler time before their Lord's arrival. For although their lives had been more modest, their burdens had been lighter and their spirits unbroken. Realizing this, their hatred of their master burned, for they knew that he was a curse upon them. However, though they despised him, still they did as he commanded, seeking to gain his favor. But more than this, some even sought to anticipate his desires, performing acts darker than he demanded, driven by the desperate hope that he might soften, and that the weight of their torment might be eased. For most, their efforts were unanswered. Yet there were a few who he marked with favor. These were the very worst of men, the merciless, the ruthless, and the ones whose footsteps echoed most often within the halls of his dark house. To these few, his friends, he bestowed the greatest gifts, and in time, these men grew mighty and arrogant, wielding their power to bind their own kin in servitude to them. And so, beneath the lash of cruelty, the burden of men's suffering deepened further still. There was no end to their labor, no peace in their unrelenting sorrow. Some men became so desperate that they found courage in anger and began to speak aloud what they had long whispered in confidence. They claimed that they saw now where the shadow truly lay, not beyond the stars, but before them, draped in the very robes of the one they called their master, and they pleaded with their kin to join them in serving him no longer. Yet terror gripped men too tightly, and they feared their master's wrath if they let this dissension go unpunished. So they turned on all those who were brave enough to speak out, and they hunted them like beasts, and they dragged them to the master's house. There they would be bound, and a fire would be set beneath them. And as the fire rose, it devoured both their flesh and the truth of their words. These sacrifices made in his honor filled their master with deep satisfaction. And for a time, it seemed the burdens of men grew lighter, their suffering tempered as if by unseen hands. Yet not all men who resisted his rule were captured. There were some who escaped, fleeing the land of Hildorian. A group of men now ventured forth from Hildorian, their steps driven by a thirst for liberation. Behind them, the weight of a brooding malice still lingered. The master's dark will no longer held them back, yet the memory of him clung to their spirits like the chill of a winter wind. They were named the Renegades by those men who remained, who they had once stood shoulder to shoulder with in the house of their lord. Perhaps you have guessed by now who this mysterious master was, the so-called giver of gifts. Was it Sauron, the deceiver, the maker of rings? No. Sauron was but an apprentice to this more menacing power. For in truth, the giver of gifts was Melkor himself, Morgoth Bauglir, the black foe of the world, the first and the greatest, the original Dark Lord. When men awoke in Hildorian at the rising of the sun, the spies of Morgoth were watchful, and tidings were soon brought to him. And this seemed to him so great a matter that secretly under shadow he himself departed from Angband and went forth into Middle-earth, leaving to Sauron the command of the war. But this design was slow to ripen and was never wholly achieved. For men, it is said, were at first very few in number, whereas Morgoth grew afraid of the growing power and union of the Eldar and came back to Angband. The design that this quote speaks of was a simple one. Melkor desired to twist men into instruments of war. and so he had journeyed to their cradle in Hildorian to corrupt them and raise them in arms against the Eldar of Beleriand. Yet his plan proved too ambitious, and it unfolded with aching slowness. The race of men was as yet barely a whisper of what they were destined to become, and far to the west, the Eldar grew mighty in their union. As their strength increased, Melkor was forced to return to Angband, abandoning Hildorian and its inhabitants for long stretches of time. Therefore, Hildorian became a place where his half-formed schemes and lies festered, and despite his absence, the corruption that he had sown lingered. But he had done enough to bring some men utterly under his dominion, and for those who remained in the east, Melkor would ever after be their god. The Atani and their kin were the descendants of peoples who in the Dark Ages had resisted Morgoth or had renounced him and had wandered ever westward from their homes far away in the east. They were ever at war with the vile things that he had bred, and especially with men who had made him their god and believed that they could render him no more pleasing service than to destroy the renegades with every kind of cruelty. Despite all of the hardships they had endured, despite Melkor's corruption, which would ever be as a stain on their existence, despite the shortening of their lives, and despite Melkor's servants prowling in the dark, ever hunting them, the ember of goodness that burned within the hearts of men was never truly extinguished. For men carried with them an instinct which called them ever westward, a sense of hope which neither darkness nor despair could sever. Deep in the marrow of their being it lingered, ancient and resolute. It was as if the memory of the first dawn, when the sun had risen in the west, called to them eternally. At the first rising of the sun, the younger children of Ilúvatar awoke in the land of Hildorian in the eastward regions of Middle-earth. But the first sun arose in the west, and the opening eyes of men were turned towards it, and their feet, as they wandered over the earth for the most part, strayed that way. And upon their travels, men began to hear tales of a great sea, wide and unyielding, and a radiant light that shone far to the west. And so they set forth, drawn toward the far horizon. Yet, in seeking the light, they would first have to endure the shadow. For another land lay sprawling before them, a realm of wonder, mystery, and dire peril. Here dwelt many of the Eldar, whose halls and glades shimmered with a timeless grace. And in the north loomed Angband, the black fortress of Morgoth. Here he gathered to his side all manner of fell creatures, dragons, werewolves, orcs, and countless other minions born of his malice. Thus the stage was set, and with the coming of men, the land of Beleriand would now be ravaged by legendary wars and bear witness to the unfolding of the great tales of the First Age. Thank you very much for tuning into Realms Unravelled. We would like to take this opportunity to light the beacons and call for aid. If you did enjoy this video, we would ask that you kindly click the like button below. Also, we would be very grateful if you would consider subscribing and clicking on the bell icon. And until next time, farewell, fellow explorers of Middle-earth.